Hello, everyone. We'll be starting in 2 minutes. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this important conversation on Russia, Latin America, and international organizations. My name is Golfo Alexopoulos. I'm professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies and director of the USF Institute on Russia. And I will be your moderator for today's discussion. The USF Institute on Russia is co-sponsoring this program together with USF's Institute for the Study of Latin America and the Caribbean, ISLAC. I'm grateful to the director of ISLAC, Dr. Beatriz Padilla, who worked with me on this event. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our two highly experienced and knowledgeable speakers who have both worked extensively in Russia and in Latin America. Ambassador Kent Brown was Foreign Service Officer for almost 30 years, serving briefly in Latin America and mostly at US embassies in Central and Eastern Europe. He spent years in Vienna and Prague and was stationed in Moscow in the Soviet era, where he served as head of the internal political section at the US Embassy. Over the years, he was involved in arms control negotiations and followed Soviet domestic and foreign policy. His last diplomatic assignment was as ambassador to the Republic of Georgia in the 1990s. After leaving the Foreign Service, he worked in the private sector, mostly on trade and regulatory issues in the former Yugoslavia. His work as consultant in Eurasia and Central Europe has focused on government relations, especially law enforcement agencies and international organizations to combat illicit trade. Dr. Betilde Munoz-Pogossian is director of the Department of Social Inclusion of the Secretariat for Access to Rights and Equity at the Organization of American States, OAS, where she's responsible for directing the work of the OAS in matters of social inclusion and access to human rights. A Venezuelan American, she has published widely, both in academic journals and in the wider press, on issues related to Latin American politics, for example, on Venezuelan migrants in Latin America and Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. She's also a founding member and coordinator of the Network of Latin American Female Political Scientists, #NoSinMujeres, a project that seeks to promote, make visible, and empower the work of women dedicated to Latin American political science. She was awarded 3 times the Outstanding Performance Award granted by the Secretary General of the OAS. Welcome to you both. I'd like to invite you each to make a few opening remarks, to share your work and your experience on international relations in your region of expertise, starting with you, Kent. Over to you.
Am I on?
Yes.
Okay, am I visible?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Golfo, for organizing this and for inviting me to participate. It's a pleasure to talk with and exchange views with you and Betilde and your audience, whoever they are, and whenever we get some questions and some remarks. I should say that international organizations is a key part of all foreign policy issues for almost all countries. Not every country is as concerned as the United States and even Russia with the international organizations that operate around the issues they're concerned with. Now, Russian policy has done a lot of, I guess, evolution over the years, sometimes devolution, but for an early time when Brezhnev was the Secretary General, and then ultimately with Andropov, who died in, I think, 1989, or I've lost my track of which decade it was. The Russians did not have a overly active process of concern about their vision, about their image. That changed when Primakov became the foreign minister and ultimately the prime minister, who decided that Russia needed to do a few things. He wanted to focus more on a multipolar world, in part to end the domination of the U.S. in the bipolar world. And he wanted to counterbalance U.S. power and influence in these international organizations. And one of the other points that Primakov made was that Russia should insist on its primacy in the post-Soviet space and lead integration in that region. And then finally, Russia should oppose NATO expansion. Those are the three principles I remember being the key words of what they call the Primakov doctrine. Now, there's many aspects to begin this discussion. One of them has to do with the EU and NATO and the G7 and the meetings that Biden had in England and in Brussels prior to meeting with Putin. First of all, to the Russians, NATO is threatening. NATO has moved right up to the Russian border. It's been of tremendous concern to the Russians. It's been part of the reasons the Russians react in the way they have on many of the issues that affect Western or Central and Western Europe. There's part of the way they've reacted to this has created more public relations problems for them. They are concerned about their image, but they want to improve that image, and their problem is that in many ways some of the things they do counteract their efforts to improve their own image. Now, I can give a number of examples where there's a difference between Russian and American policy recently. Yugoslavia is one of them. That's not so recent, but it was a fairly painful experience for the Russians when the West attacked Yugoslavia. But in the end, in the United Nations, Resolution 1244 was the one that established a UN office in Kosovo. The Russians voted for that. And then now I understand, reading in the newspapers, that the Russians are concerned about some aspects of access into Syria by humanitarian goods out of parts of Turkey. Not quite sure what's behind their concern, but they're apparently arguing with the attempt to extend the use of border posts throughout Syria and across Turkey to bring in humanitarian aid. Those are just two examples. Myanmar is another one that's going to come up because the head of Myanmar junta has just been in Moscow and was celebrated with great anticipation by the Russians. And I think the Russians have a number of reasons to do that. One is that they're expecting the West to alienate completely the Myanmar junta, and this will give them a chance to increase their influence. And the other is they're worried about Chinese influence in Myanmar. Even though Russia and China have been in agreement on a number of issues, they still have a lot of suspicions about each other's policies. There's just so many things to say about the Russians in the UN. I was involved in a few times. Once, what we used to do that back in the days of Jimmy Carter, we had U.S.-Russian consultations before the United Nations began its sessions in September. And we always had delightful conversations with the Russians. We would get together, have talks, no arguing, no hot stuff, just attempts to see if there were times at which the two could cooperate and where they could keep their competition under some measure of humanity, of good manners. That was the one of the first. There's many other aspects of the UN that I've dealt with. I should mention that there's a couple of United Nations kind of peacekeeping observer missions that have involved the Russians mostly. One is called UNOMIG, United Nations Mission, United Observer Mission in Georgia. And this was following the outbreak of the conflict in Abkhazia, and the Russians wanted to take care of that all by themselves. The US and most of the Western countries didn't want that to be just a Russian operation and knew that would mean the Russians would dominate the process. So they introduced into the UN the idea there would be an observer mission, and indeed there was an observer mission, and the fight became, what role would the Russians play? It's too complicated and too difficult for me to describe all the back and forth. As far as I know, that UNOMIG mission has ended. But then after that, an OSCE mission was, and along with it, an OSCE mission was active in Georgia. And the Russians, of course, are members of the OSCE. And there's a number of reasons why the Russians would prefer to work with the OSCE rather than fight with it. So in many cases, they've agreed with it. UNMIK, which is the UN mission in Kosovo, was approved by the Russians, along with all the others, in establishing a UN office. And so there's two UN operations I'm aware of personally dealing with, where the Russians have not been troublemakers. They've been reluctantly brought in some cases to agree to these things. But these are UN operations, and it's all to the good. It's better than shouting at each other if we can have discussions on these issues. I'm probably talking too long, but I would like to just add one other thing, that there's a number of other international organizations that the Russians are involved with and are of importance to the United States. One is BRICS, Brazil, Russia, China, who else? India and South Africa. I don't think it's a terribly important platform, but it is an attempt by the Russians to sort of return to the days when there was a non-aligned movement, which actually still does exist and is an international organization without any force or without any organization. And then OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Export Companies, petroleum exporting countries, where the Russians have been in and out, but do have a tremendous interest in what happens to the price of oil throughout the world. There's the Open Skies Treaty, which the US backed out of, and the Russians just backed out of, which I don't understand why that happened. It was a good idea to be able to overflow each other's territories to keep an eye on things. Black Sea Economic Council, there's a number of organizations that I could go on and talk about. But I think I'll stop there and pass the mic back to you, Golfo.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kent. I'd like to turn things now to Betilde for a few comments too. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Golfo, and good afternoon, good day to everyone connected virtually to this discussion. I definitely need to start thanking Professor Alexopoulos as well as Professor Beatriz Padilla and their teams at the Institutes of Russia and ISLAC, respectively, for organizing this event, and also for the invitation to participate, and which actually takes me close to home because I'm also a USF alumni and my family still lives in Tampa, although I am connecting from Washington, D.C. So great to be here with you. And I'm going to bring us closer to to home also to the Western Hemisphere. I wanted to actually talk a little bit about the work that we do at the Organization of American States, the OAS, which is actually the oldest regional organization that was founded back in the 1890, between 1889 and 1890, when the first International Conference of American States took place in Washington, D.C., here in the city where I am now. But of course took the shape that we know today when the charter of the OAS was signed and ratified in 1948 by member states. And this charter was signed in Bogota and pretty much gave the raison d'etre, the reason for being for this regional organization, focusing on issues of peace, order, peace, justice, just solidarity and cooperation between countries, and it emphasized a lot the whole issue of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, because of course that was fresh in the history of our hemisphere. Nowadays, the OAS is composed by 35 independent states, currently, and we are going to talk a little bit more later on how Cuba and the standing of Venezuela and Cuba in the organization, but they are part of the founding members of the OAS. And it's actually where all countries, governments of these countries meet to discuss regional issues, thematic issues along the priorities that the member states themselves have established, right? And sometimes to solve disputes and solve discrepancies that they may face. What do we do in terms of functions? Well, we focus on the issue of promoting democracy, also coordinating security and law enforcement operations and cooperation and collaboration amongst countries. We also do technical assistance to development projects, although there's other institutions in the inter-American system, like the IDB, for instance, that do this type of work too. And one of the also most important activities, I would say, that the OAS provides is the monitoring of human rights and situations that are threatening human rights in the region. And of course, there's a particular institutionality for this issue. So in sum, there's 4 pillars that kind of encompass the work of the OAS: democracy, security, development, and human rights. And in this bigger context, I am director of the Department of Social Inclusion. It's a technical area within the Secretariat for Access to Rights and Equity. That was actually, we were established, one of the youngest areas within the organization. We were established in 2015 with a specific role of consolidating the role of the OAS as a facilitator, as a point of reference, as a promoter of dialogue amongst countries on issues of development with equality and social inclusion, which was part and it's contained in the charter and it's mentioned in a lot of our resolutions, non-binding resolutions, but until 2015, it had not really been taken on full force and explicitly established an institutionality to address the issue of equity and social inclusion. So this happens in 2015. Since then, we have been focusing the work on cooperating with member states in the formulation of public policies, the execution of programs and projects, usually with external funding, with donor funding, because the OAS doesn't have in its regular funding, specific funding for these types of projects. We do this usually with the support of donors from outside. And in essence, what we do is to work with member states to address the main issues they are facing in terms of social inclusion, access to rights in all dimensions, let's say, not just civil and political, but also economic, social, and cultural rights. And there's many ways that we try to do this in terms of the house. We do it building capacity in the government so that they can do their job better. And this could be via trainings or it may be via providing, sending missions to provide advisory services when they're about to approve a law or design a specific policy. Also give them advice when they're like putting together public policies that seek to generate this equity, and we use as a framework all the inter-American instruments of human rights that have been approved in the context of the OAS. I always say these are sort of our navigation chart, ¿no? Nuestra carta de navegación in terms of ensuring that public policies help bring rights to people. And of course, the two functions by excellence, par excellence, are of course promoting policy dialogues and political dialogue amongst countries, and of course opportunities for cooperation amongst countries. In the particular department that I'm responsible for, and my time is running up, we do all of this that I just described in the areas of economic and social rights, poverty reduction, and the promotion of equity. And we mostly do this with working together with the ministries of social development or social inclusion. The names vary country by country. Working on issues of the inclusion of groups in vulnerable situations, such as Afro-descendants, indigenous peoples, peoples with disabilities, again, using as the framework all the instruments of human rights that have been approved by member states. And also in the last area, which is a hot area, I would say, and I think Golfo mentioned that I write a lot about it, is the whole issue of migration and forced displacement. This used to be part of the work that the OAS did for many, many years, mostly generating data and statistics on this. But lately, because we as a region are facing important forced displacement crises, we have been getting a lot of demand from member states to give them support in implementing projects on the ground. And this is mainly because we now face the displacement crisis, which is actually the largest displacement crisis the Western Hemisphere has had, which is the displacement of over 5 million Venezuelans. Actually, the second largest displacement crisis in the world after Syria nowadays. But we also are monitoring and supporting countries receiving more than 100 Nicaraguans who have been leaving the country since April of 2018, when they had a high point in terms of social and political crises. And we see that this is starting again. I don't know if you've been monitoring the news, those of you who follow Latin American politics, but it's getting complicated in Nicaragua again, politically speaking, and we should see an impact also in people being displaced. And of course, something that has been in the news a lot, which is what's called the Central American migration crisis, or namely the displacement of around 1 million Central Americans from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, usually through Mexico as a country of transit, with the US as their final destination. So all of this is what we are doing at the Department of Social Inclusion. I'm going to stop here because there's very interesting questions that are coming, I know, and I want to get to those. And again, thank you, Golfo, for the invitation, and I give the floor back to you.
Thank you so much, Betilde. I do want to follow up on a number of things that you both brought up. You both mentioned how the OAS and the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, both of these organizations are deeply involved in human rights and protecting human rights. And I wonder, and yet in both regions, there are authoritarian states that are big violators of human rights. So how can these organizations act to check human rights violators, to promote human rights? Could you please assess the capabilities and the limitations of the OAS and the OSCE with respect to human rights? And I'll start with you, Betilde, please.
Sure, thank you so much for that question. Very valid. I mean, we do in the Western Hemisphere, we still have, we have a majority of democratic regimes. However, there's still situations like the one in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba, where we continue to see violations of human rights. So in terms of the functions in this realm, definitely monitoring these situations, as well as denouncing when they occur, and this is actually permanent in the case of these three countries, and this is our Secretary General, Luis Almagro, an Uruguayan national, has had a very important leadership role in calling attention to these situations. But beyond that, in concretely, we also have an inter-American system of human rights that is composed by two institutions, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, and that is based here in Washington, D.C., actually the same place where I work, the headquarters of the OAS, and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights based in San Jose, Costa Rica. And these are really when rights are violated and there's no any reparation to the people who are suffering these vulnerabilities on the part of the state, they have the commission and the court as a resource to get these reparations, to bring a cause and of course bring all the supporting documentation, testimonies to get some recourse on the violations. And these are actually historic. They were founded along with the OAS, and they have the specific role of protecting human rights when states fail to do this.
Thank you. Kent, about the OSCE?
It's a long story, but the OSCE process began in Finland in 1973, I think, and a series of negotiations that took place there revealed that the Russians were pushing to include, or to at least address the issues of security of borders and defensive issues against attack. The West said that's a good idea, but we want to also not forget about human rights. So eventually there became about three baskets, they called them. One had to do with security issues, one had to do with human rights issues, and one had to do with economic issues. And those three baskets are what the OSCE remains committed to worrying about. The fact that was included in the Helsinki Final Act was a big victory, in my view, for the West. And in fact, it's not a zero-sum game. The Russians also benefited from it. The West, ever since, has not let up on its pressures via the OSCE, and it's not just the West, but even many of the countries used to call neutral are very concerned about human rights, especially now in Belarus, for example. And in the defensive area, it's interesting that in the OSCE, the Russians, sometime in the last couple of years, asked the OSCE to establish a border patrol on the Ukrainian-Russian border, and the OSCE agreed to do so. So that's one area where the organization has addressed a Russian concern. I'm still not clear in my mind what it was that was behind the Russian request, but still all these baskets are intermingled and of great interest to all members of the OSCE. That's it.
Thank you. I want to stay with you, Kent, for a moment and ask, just this week, France and Germany proposed an EU summit with Vladimir Putin as a way of improving relations with the Kremlin. There hasn't been a meeting of this kind since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and invaded eastern Ukraine. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel said, and I quote, "We as the European Union must seek direct contact with Russia and the Russian president. It's not enough for the US president to talk to the Russian president. I very much welcome that, but the EU must create forums for dialogue." Now, we know we've talked already about how international organizations create these forums for dialogue, but not everyone has been on board with this EU, with resuming the EU-Russia summits. Poland and the Baltic states are just some examples of countries that say that there should be some preconditions, or there should be some goodwill gesture from the Kremlin first. How important do you think it is to maintain these forums, even when there are no preconditions, there are no expressions of goodwill, even when tensions run high? What do you think?
I think they're very valuable, such forums. One of the, I should say, challenges in the EU is that the newer members from the East, the ones closest to Russia, have been quite suspicious of and resistant to change in any policies towards the Russians. But nevertheless, part of this process is going to be discussions between the Poles and the Hungarians and the Germans and the French and the Baltic republics on exactly what it is we need to achieve vis-a-vis the Russians. And there'll be economic aspects, no doubt to that, but it's mostly, I think, going to be viewed as an effort to get a message across to the Russians that they simply must respect EU members, NATO members who have joined lately, because those are the ones that are the greatest perturbations for the Russians. So basically, these kinds of efforts are fine. I don't know where it will go. Maybe they will establish a series of panels to discuss the specific issues, and fine, let them do it that way. Talking is better than anything else.
Thank you. Betilde, I want to ask you about vaccine diplomacy. This is a big issue now. About 9 countries in Latin America have signed on to Russia's Sputnik V vaccine. Russia has promised Venezuela about 10 million doses of the vaccine. It's much cheaper, about half the price of Western vaccines. It can be stored in a conventional refrigerator. It makes sense practically, and the vaccine, we should say, has also been demonstrated to be safe and effective. Do you think that there is any issue here with Russia's influence in Latin America, the use of the vaccine to extend its influence, or do you just see this as a practical arrangement? What's your assessment?
I think probably the answer is a little bit of both, really, because definitely the vaccine and cooperation in health is another form for Russia to have presence in Latin American countries, to continue sort of positioning itself as a player in even in solving the tension and the situations that we have in places like Venezuela and Nicaragua, right? So definitely is an effort to have presence in the region and exert influence. However, from the practical point of view, there is inequality in access to vaccines. And the highest numbers of infections and very outrageous numbers of people dying of COVID-19 in Latin America is something that the governments need to address. And there's non-equitable access to the purchase of these vaccines. I also believe it's another way to maybe pressure the US in terms of providing additional cooperation in the form of vaccines. So, and this is all helpful in terms of generating that herd immunity that is needed for Latin American countries to have some sort of normalcy to reactivate their economies and start worrying about the effects and the other pandemic, which is going to be economic and social.
Right. Mm-hmm. Can I stay with you for a moment, Betilde, and ask specifically about Venezuela, because the country has experienced, as you said, overlapping crises in recent years: economic, political, humanitarian. Human Rights Watch indicated that President Nicolas Maduro has used the pandemic to crack down even more. Non-governmental organizations that have tried to provide food aid have been vilified as agents of the opposition. Why are efforts failing, do you think? I know that there is an attempt now by the government of Norway. The international community has tried to step in. How would you assess the role of the international community in alleviating the crisis in Venezuela?
It has actually been a lot of help in terms of especially food insecurity, as well as access to medicines and medical services. Of course, my mandate within the organization is in the social inclusion and access to rights area. However, our Secretary General has been a voice of calling attention and generating the needed discussions that need to happen on the Venezuelan crisis. Of course, it's a combination of factors. It's the need to have a unified opposition, the need to have conditions where if there's when the negotiation happens, it happens in between two equal forces, and this is still not the case. In practical terms, the government, Maduro's regime has not been able to provide for all of the rights and all of the needs of the Venezuelan people. And agencies such as UNHCR, IOM, the World Food Program, UNAIDS have, and of course OCHA, the Office of Humanitarian Support, have a presence in the country and have been able to, sort of close the gaps in terms of the needs and the humanitarian needs that people have. So definitely, especially the UN system has played a very important role on the ground, covering the needs. And I must also mention the important role that local NGOs as well as international NGOs, including the Red Cross, are and Catholic charities. I mean, the Catholic Church and other religious organizations. They've been really great in terms of supporting the Venezuelan people in terms of their basic needs.
Great, thank you. I want to encourage our audience to begin submitting questions. We already have a few in, and I'd like to direct the next one to Kent. Ken, we have a question here for you. Are international relations in terms of spheres of influence a zero-sum competition, or can global relationships be managed from a win-win formula? If yes, what is that formula?
Well, it depends on the issue. Sometimes, in fact, most of the time, I think the US and Russian and EU attitudes towards international organizations is competitive. But the very fact that these organizations exist as platforms for discussions between East and West, we could say, is a very positive one. And many times there are areas of just cooperation and agreement that can be found by these discussions. So it's not always a zero-sum game. It's hardly ever a zero-sum game, although in some people's minds it is. But the important thing is that people are looking for middle ground, usually, even the ones who are the most, shall we say, suspicious of international organizations. So I would say that it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a field of competition always, and we have to remember that things do come out of these agreements that relax tensions, shall we say.
If I may add, I couldn't agree more with Kent. I mean, and nowadays, you cannot have agreements where one part of the deal wins it all and the other one loses. I mean, this is ineffective, it's unsustainable, and it's not really, I don't know, moral, right? So, and I think the world is moving ever more to this, exactly what Kent is describing, where agreements are made so that there's a win-win situation as best, or, get as close as possible to this win-win situation, not have one lose.
Thank you very much. If I can follow up on that, when President Biden was in Europe recently, he mentioned that it's in a country's interest to be involved, to be engaged in international organizations, to be engaged in international dialogue, because it advances their credibility. Is that what you have observed as well? What do you both think about that? Is it in the interests of a country, even those that often don't behave very well on the international stage? Is it still in their interest to try to play according to international norms?
Should I
Yes,
try my
please.
hand at it?
Please.
One of the things that Putin said, at least implied during his discussions or his press briefing after the fact, was that the international rules are quite often not in Russia's interests in the sense that it is interference in their internal affairs. I guess that's a simple way to put it. And international organizations such as NGOs that come in to Russia or try to come into Russia and have an effect on Russian attitudes and Russian policies and procedures as useful as they might be to Russia to find new ways of making decisions and so forth, are not welcome these days. So that's one of the problems that there is in dealing with the Russians, that international organizations and non-governmental organizations are viewed relatively suspiciously by the Russians. They have their own set of international organizations they like there's an agreement called, I think it's the Eurasian Economic Union. It's kind of their answer to the EU. It's not terribly influential, but nevertheless, it makes the Russians feel they have some influence in the rest of Central Asia. There's the Shanghai, I can't remember what it is, agreement, Shanghai Security Agreement. So those are all things that the Russians have been in favor of. And so it's a mixed picture as usual for the Russians.
I would say too, I mean, I would have to agree. It's an issue of ensuring and maintaining credibility. Of course, it's an issue of influence. I mean, if there are issues, maybe trade or migration or whatever the topic, even human rights, that are dear to you, that you are part of your foreign policy, you want to influence that conversation. And the best way, the platform, as Kent was mentioning, to have that conversation, to exert that influence is, and in a respectful way, where everyone sits and their voices and votes are worth the same, are international organizations. And it's also it's practical, because to get things done in general consensus on things, on different topics, again, I mean, climate change and commitments that we all in the world are going to make in terms of reducing gas emissions. These conversations can happen in the context of international organizations. Of course, the challenge is how to translate those conversations and those commitments into actual results. That's what we all need to push international organizations towards. But definitely it is the perfect place to have the conversations, to exert influence and get things done on the issues that matter in your foreign policy.
Betilde, I would like to stay with you for a moment and ask about Cuba, because it's so interesting, the relationship of Cuba and the OSCE. Could you let our audience know exactly what that relationship is and what you think the relationship should be between Cuba and the OAS?
Cuba is actually also a founding member of the OAS, and it had participated since its creation. However, it was suspended from the OAS in 1962. It was in 2009 that a new conversation arose, and the foreign ministers in the OAS General Assembly that took place in San Pedro Sula, Honduras, in 2009 approved a resolution that kind of rescinded the previous resolution that had suspended Cuba in 1962. And then, they added a language that opened the door for the Republic of Cuba to participate again at the OAS, indicating that it would be as a result of a process of dialogue that had to be initiated by the government of Cuba, kind of like putting the ball on their court. And of course, emphasizing the need for Cuba to abide by the principles, norms, and the spirit of the OAS, which of course include the issue of democracy and human rights. This is an ongoing conversation. Cuba has not initiated any conversation and any dialogue to re-enter the OAS, so it's still not participating. But I mean, it is pending. That conversation is pending, and again, it's in the court of the Cubans to start it.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn now to some questions from the audience, and Kent, you get the first question. When you were negotiating arms control agreements, what were some of the most difficult aspects of the negotiation that you encountered? What barriers were the hardest to overcome as an ambassador?
Well, I was involved in both strategic and conventional arms control, but much more so in conventional arms control, But I think that the same challenges existed in both areas. The main one being verification of agreements, a verification of warheads, verification of tanks, verification of troop numbers. Very difficult, and for years and years we had discussions with the Warsaw Pact, NATO, to try to find ways to satisfy their concern over spying on them. But that was the whole issue. We did want to spy on them. We want to know what they were doing. Not that we were trying to find out their secrets. We wanted to find out how many troops they had, where they were, and so forth. I guess that was a secret in many cases. But we were prepared on the Western side to open ourselves up because we were already open. And so the Soviets and their allies didn't have much trouble figuring out what the West and the NATO people were up to. What is really the challenge is as well what I would call alliance management in the case of conventional arms control discussions. Many of the NATO allies in the MBFR talks, mutual balanced force reduction talks, were anxious to show progress. And the US said, take it easy, slow down. We just have lots of issues to resolve with the Warsaw Pact. We can't hurry. So please relax. And so the Germans in particular were concerned, not that they really expected a serious agreement, but they wanted to appear to give the image that there's progress being made. They wanted to give that reassurance to the German public. So to a certain extent, the US had certainly had to adjust its own policies to not seem to be anti-progress, but at the same time to keep down the desire for rapid results. And the same thing has happened in the strategic arms control talks. Many times we have had to discuss with the British their nuclear forces, and they would always worry that we would do something stupid and include British forces in our overall counts. And we had to reassure them on a number of occasions that was not going to be the case. Anyway, that's there's a lot more to say, but I think that's enough for now.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here on just your experiences. What advice would you have for students who want to pursue careers in international affairs? And I'd like to start with Betilde, please.
Sure. That's a great question, and I love that students are already, thinking how to, or forward thinking their careers. That's awesome. I would definitely recommend trying to do an internship in the next available summer opportunity or other regular semester opportunities in a multilateral organization. Definitely the UN is an option for graduate students. The internships is only for graduate students, but OAS, IDB, the World Bank, right? These are good opportunities to learn the work that is done in these institutions. And it's also a great place to make connections and build networks that could be useful at the time that you're going to graduate. I definitely would recommend deliberately sitting down and thinking what you want your area of expertise to be. The sooner you do this, the better, because this would allow you to start building your CV towards those 1, 2, 3 areas of expertise where you want to consolidate your professional profile and then eventually apply and get a job. And once you know what those 2, 3 areas are, be on top of what's happening in that particular field in terms of what's being said in academia as well as what's happening in real life, right? Be on top of it, be aware of it, internalize what's happening in those areas of expertise. Find a referent, a referent really, I don't know if that's the term, but a person that you look up to, that you aspire to be, and connect to that person and ask what that person did to get to where they are, what they studied, different opportunities that they sought to be able to create the profile they have. It's always good to do that, and if you can make a connection, even better. And on the issue of connections, I would recommend that you work on networking, but not networking, as I say, in the traditional way. Really build human-centered networks where you actually generate value for the people that you are establishing a working relationship with, or that you, or professional connection with, and that you don't seek out only for a particular issue or a selfish interest, but because you really want to build that connection in the long term. This is really what makes a professional connection sustainable, and these are the type of people that you really reach out in a genuine manner, in a human-centered manner. Those are the ones who will advocate for you, who will throw your name when an opportunity comes, in a way become, sometimes, I've had the privilege to have sponsors that really put in the word and are already always recommending me and my professional expertise for particular job opportunities.
Thank you. Kent, could you address this question as well?
Well, I agree with everything Betilde said. I think she's hit almost all the main points. I would only have a slightly additional point, which is that if you're an American citizen, you may want to approach international organizations through American institutions, State Department, USAID, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, the Department of Commerce, all these things, because quite often an international organization will pick people based on their nationality. And I don't know if they still have, or if they ever actually had, a quota system for all the countries of the world to have jobs in the UN. But the US probably has a number of positions that are kind of guaranteed, or not guaranteed, but assumed to be for American citizens, just as the Nigerians would have a series of jobs they would like, or the Uruguayans. So there's not only approaching international organizations themselves or NGOs, but also approaching individual governments to make your interest in international organizations known.
Great, thank you. We also have another question for both of you. What steps can we take to create a more informed public when it comes to matters of foreign policy and international organizations? In both of your regions, there are issues with goodness, in our region as well, in our country as well, there are problems with disinformation, misinformation, a lack of credible information. How can we create a more informed public when it comes to matters of foreign policy and international relations? Betilde?
Yes, that's a great question. I think it all points to education, really, as strengthening opportunities for young people, but people throughout their life cycle, to have opportunities to learn about world affairs, international organizations, what's really happening out there, because ultimately it does impact their life, on an individual level, but in terms of their own country. So, it has to do with these opportunities. I think, for instance, an excellent way for people in high school, and also universities to understand these dynamics, world dynamics, is the Model UN or Model OAS exercises that show young people, what really happens in a negotiation of an arms trade deal, what really happens when countries are deciding whether to bring Cuba back to the OAS or not. These are excellent opportunities for that. And I think we all have a responsibility, really. I mean, if we are people interested in world affairs, in international relations, and we encounter people who are completely clueless and unaware, we have a responsibility also to, share what we know and point people to not sources of disinformation, but reliable sources of information that they can visit and go and read to have a greater awareness on particular issues.
Thank you. Kent?
One of the things I would warn anybody about is to be skeptical of US media, and in fact any country's media, about the way they approach issues. The old, maybe it never did exist, but my impression is that journalism should be analytical, not advocacy. And journalists and their editors should be publishing stories that show more than one side of the issue. Now it seems that there's more and more competition to give an exciting headline to get people to read your paper or to listen to your station, and that's unfortunate. But I think the answer is that anybody who's watching what's going on American TV, especially, and probably any TV, should be aware that quite often the analysis is not really an analysis, but advocacy of a certain point of view. Then the social media issue is that there's a million different versions of what people are saying. And I would say to people, be very suspicious of what you read in items on the social media, because they are even less likely to be an attempt to objectively look at an issue and more likely to bend your attitude towards something.
And just to add, definitely, I agree with Kent, and verify. Verify. There are actually websites that you can find where you know, when they send something to you via WhatsApp or you see it in Instagram, on Twitter, you can go to these websites and make sure that this is really a piece of reliable information and not advocacy pieces that some sectors, you know, throw out there to influence conversations.
Thank you. We only have 5 minutes left, but I want to include one quick question for each of you before we wrap up. Betilde, we have a question here about the Venezuelan election and OAS. While the OAS has declared the 2018 Venezuelan election as fraudulent, has there been any further intervention, or has it remained mostly hands-off by viewing the issue as one that's that relates to the internal matters of Venezuela?
Definitely not hands-off. The Secretary General Almagro has been following up closely on this. Also, for those of you who are not aware, he also conducted a panel of 3 judges with regional influence and you know, a lot of expertise in the area of crimes against humanity. And his report, composed by these 3 judges, was sent to the International Criminal Court. I mean, he's active in terms of the issue of elections too, coordinating with other member states, but also with the caretaker government of Juan Guaido. I mean, there's close collaboration on the part of the OAS. Of course, you're talking about the 2018 elections. There was another set of elections that were not internationally recognized in 2020, right? And then now there's discussions for a regional election. And on the part of the OAS, there are serious questionings and concerns about the fairness and how free these elections are, because they're still political prisoners. Some political parties are still prohibited from participating. I mean, the mass media is controlled by the Maduro regime. There's so many issues in terms of democratic standards that are not being met that, you know, really put into question the validity of the elections that are going to happen.
Thank you so much. And Kent, one final question for you. A student writes, as a dual citizen of the Russian Federation and the United States, it's been very disheartening for me to watch tensions rise between countries. Do you see any potential for the 2 countries to reconcile in the future? What role might international organizations play in the de-escalation of animosity between Russia and the United States?
Well, both Biden and Putin addressed this, and I thought were very cool and skeptical it would be rapid change in the relationship. But I think that their meeting got a good start and reflected, at least in the U.S. case, sort of a problem is in the case of Putin. Does he have enough people on board for what he said for him to follow through with some of the implied concessions he made, and not concessions, but the gestures he made towards Biden? And I'm thinking, for example, on cybersecurity. It seems to me that's great grounds for the 2 countries and others to join in to have a negotiation on the way in which cyber violations, cyber hacking, cyber warfare can be conducted. And I'm not sure that everybody in Russia agrees that that's a good idea. I think that most people in America agree it's a good idea, but it doesn't matter. Can we get not only agreement on where that ought to go, but how to get there? And I think it's going to be extremely difficult. I can't imagine the verification challenges in that particular field. But in any issue that we deal with the Russians, there's tremendous suspicion. You're quite right. It's inspired in part by the US political debate. And I think the time has come where, with Biden's discussions, to start being more mature about Russia in the US Congress.
Thank you so much. So we'll conclude here. As we conclude our discussion, I want to extend a sincere thank you to our speakers, Ambassador Kent Brown and Dr. Betilde Munoz-Pogossian. You guys have been great. Thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation and for sharing your expertise and analysis with us. As was evident from our discussion today, it's really valuable to bring a comparative perspective to our study of global problems. And thank you to my partners, the Institute for the Study of Latin America and the Caribbean, ISLAC. If you want to learn more about the Institute on Russia and ISLAC, you can reach out on our website and on social media. Thank you to our audience, to the College of Arts and Sciences, and to our donors and supporters for making events like these possible. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thanks so much for the invite.